Radio Show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV Radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Fission radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear. Good morning, UCY.TV radio listeners. This is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. Thank you for joining us. Today is February 15th, 2017. It's 8 o'clock here in Eugene, Oregon on the Pacific Coast. And we have with us a guest today that I just met a few weeks ago after our guest, Heidi Lambert, was on the show a few weeks ago, was talking about white male privilege and the, I think it's called the 3 pillars of racism or white male privilege. And she said she got a lot of these concepts from a friend of hers who was named Jill Wheaton, who has a master's degree in applied anthropology and a minor in queer studies. So I gave her a call, and she's here with us. Thanks for joining us, Jill. I really appreciate your time.
Hello, Lonnie. Thank you for having me.
This is really awesome. So one of the things we thought we'd discuss kind of a little bit more in depth was these concepts that you told me were really written by Andrea Smith, which are the 3 pillars of white supremacy. And do you want to go into that a little bit more? Because I think I'm bungling the concept here, but it's really important now because we're experiencing a lot of that attitude in our culture right now with the Trump nation.
Sure. So the work that I had spoken with Heidi about and that we're going to discuss today is called The 3 Pillars of Heteropatriarchy and White Supremacy. And like you said, it was written by Andrea Smith. Oh, I'm sorry, it's Heteropatriarchy and the 3 Pillars of White Supremacy. And so she actually wrote this work to kind of, because she saw, as an organizer herself, that a lot of times when women of color get together to try and organize to fight against oppression and to empower themselves, a lot of times there were problems that would arise and create conflict within groups of women of color who really wanted to find unity but couldn't get past certain issues. And I read this work a few years ago, and it stayed with me because in this work, Smith really wanted to seek to provide a framework for organizing that, in her words, does not assume that racism and white supremacy is enacted in a singular fashion. Rather, white supremacy is constituted by separate and distinct but still interrelated logic. And so that is why I kind of shared this work with Heidi. But I think that before we jump into that work, we kind of need to take a step back and understand what the idea and concept of white supremacy is. A lot of times we think of white supremacy with a capital W and a capital S. We think of neo-Nazis, we think of the KKK, and that is one facet of white supremacy. That is a very visible facet of it. But what many people don't understand is that white supremacy is more than just that. I have a great definition here written by Elizabeth Martinez. Mm-hmm. She defines white supremacy as a historically based, institutionally perpetuated system of exploitation and oppression of continents, nations, and people of color by white people and nations of the European continent for the purpose of maintaining and defending a system of wealth, power, and privilege. And when we
pretty much sums it up, that pretty much sums it up.
Right. Wow. And when we begin to think of, white supremacy as, not people hiding behind hoods trying to inflict terror, but rather the day-to-day actions of your average white person going about their business, blindly supporting systems on particular lands, with holding the wealth, power, and privilege, that really calls, that's just a different way of thinking about it. In your introduction, you speak of saving the world from greed and indifference. I think that truly understanding what white supremacy is the first step towards making that happen. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I say that is because most wealth, whether it be monetary wealth, the wealth of power, and the wealth of privilege, is held by people, and I think a lot of indifference comes from the way white supremacy creates racial hierarchies, and where not only do we not have to worry about the problems of people of the same race and color as us, we don't have to worry about them if they don't have the same wealth and power. We certainly don't have to worry about people that don't look like us and don't hold the same things that we do. Mm-hmm. So I think actually beginning to unpack this idea of white supremacy and white privilege is the first step in addressing these further problems.
It's such a emotionally supercharged. I mean, you start talking about white supremacy, and then the automatic reflex starts talking about like the black people and just the whole vitriol about the oppression. I mean, I honestly go on about the epidemic of battery among women and children in this country because I think that I believe that I think they're interlinked into the whole system of denial that we're plugged into. I think it's part of the whole thing, and it is about the white supremacy, taking it just for granted as if that's normal, as if that's the way it always has been and the way it always will be. It's and we're coming into a clash of time where we can't live like that anymore as a species. We just can't do it. We have to come together to save our planet.
I completely agree. What you're saying, what you're seeing, has roots. In you and I share a culture that has spread around the world for thousands of years, and a lot of times race gets in the way of people seeing that similarity. But what you're saying, the abuse of women and children, that is the idea of the heteropatriarchy, that the male is in charge of the nuclear family, and a lot of times we only think of that as simple patriarchy, but when we think of it as heteropatriarchy, You have to understand that this idea of a nuclear family completely eliminates queer and multiple gendered people. And so, again, within the history of our culture, the queer people of multiple genders, and even just saying people of multiple genders, that is an idea that's kind of now come about, but has persisted for, ultimately forever. As long as there have been people, there have always been people that have identified as neither male nor female. So when we think of just patriarchy, we have to remember that it's actually heteropatriarchy, because there's no room in the patriarchy for queer and multiple gendered people. You either have to be male or female, and you have to fit into the nuclear family, where the male is the head of the household.
Mm. I hadn't actually thought of it when you're calling it the nuclear family. I mean, I my ears perk up because of this. Frankly, I got into this because of the nuclear lies, and the more I am going on and interviewing activists and people of different sections of our culture, I'm beginning to realize the use of the word nuclear was not accidental. It was a way to promulgate the status quo, to keep people believing they have no control over it. I mean, that whole thing about
Exactly.
the nuclear family, it really is with the male in charge, the white male in charge. And ultimately, the deference to that thing is what's really eating away at our culture. I mean, there's a lot of distrust now because we've opened up the conversation. I mean, just the fact that we're even willing to talk about it, a lot of people just feel like that's just liberal hooey and we shouldn't even be talking about it, and you're just trying to turn everybody queer. The whole conversation is just a knee-jerk reaction to keep the status quo. It's astounding, to be honest, like how it's almost like Pavlov's dog. You get that immediate reaction whenever you talk about. But I mean, especially the white male supremacy, we're living in a nation right now where the KKK hats have literally come out. Like, people are getting beat up, queer people are getting beat up, people of color. I mean, I'm still dumbfounded over that story that I read yesterday about the Tulsa Police Department. They decided they were participating in a reality TV show, and they were following him around, and they canceled the show because the reality TV show just basically highlighted the racial profiling that was going on day after day after day. So it was really
Right.
stunning.
Right. But it's important to remember, though, that it's not just the white male. And the thing about heteropatriarchy and white supremacy
Well, would you mind
is
explaining
that,
that, what
yeah,
heteropatriarchy means, so you can define that term?
sure. So again, heteropatriarchy is the idea, number one, that everybody is straight, that everybody is a heterosexual being. That is, they're solely attracted to somebody of the opposite sex, that there are only two genders, and that within those two genders, the male is the superior of the two. And so that ultimately is what heteropatriarchy means. And that's why it's important to say heteropatriarchy, because again, if we just call things patriarchy, that there's a built-in assumption that there's only two genders and that there's only two ways of being. And I think in the world, we've now come to, once again, to the understanding that there are more than two genders, that people cannot be forced into either a male or female expression of who they are.
Right.
Because it's important to remember that the way that our culture has built up genders is that we perform a role as a woman or we perform a role as a man. And that's a big part of queer theory, is that, being queer opens up space to form something different and to
Right.
be
And you're
something
not
different,
using
and
the
that's a
term
more
even
in that space.
homosexual. Even not the word homosexual is different than the term queer. So that's a whole different
Exactly.
thing.
Exactly. So, yeah, because I'm not strictly talking about um, sex. I'm talking about sexual expression,
Hmm.
and and that is a completely different thing. You know, who we have sex with is a part of that for sure, but insisting that people all be in one of two genders and then one gender being superior to the other. That's this idea of heteropatriarchy.
Well, these are concepts that really have been suppressed for, I mean, seriously, thousands of years that are just now gaining expression in our culture, at least. I mean,
Sure,
the
sure.
concept that gender does not exactly equal sexuality. It takes a people, it sort of twists their ideas of who we are and what we are. But that is kind of the reality that your gender identification has nothing to do with your sexual orientation. That's why we have many uh, women who were born men have lived male lives, and then when they get to an age where they don't care anymore, they can start living their lives as women, and yet they're still attracted to women's because they have, they have male parts. They respond to women like heterosexual males, so their gender identity is different. So it gets kind of, this is where it gets into really just fundamentally respecting people's sense of being, allowing someone to be who they are and without demeaning them or making them less than because they have a different sense of gender identity. This is why it sort of leans on these three pillars of white supremacy, because the white supremacist like puts us into such a small little tiny box, and if you get out of that
Exactly.
box, then they feel entitled to be violent with you. That's the key here, is that's what this epidemic of beating children and women, and the this whole freak out about the pedophile ring. You notice we don't hear about that, but I mean, we all know that battery of children and sexual abuse of women and children is commonplace. I mean, this is why the slut walk was started. A cop actually told a woman who had been assaulted, if you didn't dress like that, you wouldn't be assaulted. Like, literally, a police officer said that to her. I
Well,
mean,
that's
that's
the thing about heteropatriarchy is that heteropatriarchy and white supremacy, anybody is welcome to join it, because what we're talking about ultimately is a system of power. And remember, it's a system of who holds the wealth, who holds the power, and who holds the privilege. And so anybody is welcome to join welcome to join in. That is why anybody of color is welcome to join in, say, like a police force, like you were just saying, because the police have the power. But within police forces, as we understand, there are racial hierarchies. And so anyone is welcome to join into the system of power, because ultimately that supports the system that we live under.
mhm.
But when you resist that, that's when you get real change, because what we're talking about is the domination and oppression of people for, whatever, be it race, sexuality, or gender.
Yeah.
And, and not to forget about ability, that's an important thing as well. I think this is probably a good time to kind of go back over, we've kind of defined what heteropatriarchy is. So let's go over the three pillars of white supremacy. So
Perfect.
again, Smith's intention in creating this work was so that she could provide a framework for people to begin to understand in organizing that not everybody experiences white supremacy in the same way. I wouldn't consider myself an organizer, but I have taken these ideas and I think about them in my everyday life, because, it's not just in organizing that we need to re-examine our thinking and maybe build a new foundation. So so Smith has, three pillars, and they're very much race-based, because, again, this is under the system of white supremacy, and you can't have white without people of color, the other. And so the first pillar in her structure is this idea of slavery and capitalism. Now, slavery specifically looks at Black people in the United States, and it renders so the logic of white supremacy renders Black people as inherently slaveable, as nothing more than property. And I'm sure there's people saying, well, slavery is over. But the reality is the look of slavery may have changed over time, but slavery itself, the enslavement of Black people, still persists today. We have the prison industrial complex, which is vastly, way more so with people of color, particularly Black males, than anybody else. And that itself perpetuates slavery. People are expected to work in prison. They're barely paid anything. They don't have their freedom, and a lot of times, they're sentenced for a lot longer than their white counterparts. And
I think there's been lots of studies that shows that. Lots and lots
of slavery.
Of
studies. Exactly.
I mean, it's really simple. We can open up any newspaper any day of the week. I mean, just last week there was a guy convicted of rape, and he was a white guy with blue eyes, put on probation for 3 years as long as he went to a class.
Exactly.
Let's just be really clear.
Rapist.
If Barack Obama had been doing what Donald Trump has been doing in the last 2 weeks, there would have been a lynching, to be honest. I mean, that people would have just gone off the charts. Look what did happen when he became president. People had the nerve to put up posters with a bone through his nose to the president of the United States. It was unbelievable.
The current president felt he had the power, the privilege, and the space to constantly challenge this man's birth, his right to be in the job that he was elected to hold, and that's white supremacy in action.
And his wife has been called a man. There's people out there who have argued with me that Michelle Obama must be a man. Look at those arms. I mean, really, seriously, I find that so offensive. Because
and what you're seeing, and that's white supremacy. This idea that women are supposed to look a certain way, and if they're not that, then there must be something else. So the point of all of that, the point of seeing Black people as slaves, ultimately is kind of the cornerstone of capitalism. Capitalism ultimately sees people as property or as a commodity. Somewhere, everybody falls along somewhere in the line of capitalism. You're either a producer, a consumer, you're the slave labor. Everybody is along there. And a lot of times, people don't have let's take Barack and Michelle Obama. People do not have a problem with those kind of things being said, the fact that those things can be said, because ultimately white supremacy whispers in your ear that at least, you're not Black, you're not the bottom of the racial hierarchy,
right.
You can never be a slave. Right. So you have to reinforce those systems so that you can protect yourself from being the slave, the commodity of capitalism. That's why we see those things go on, particularly around Black people. I myself am a Native American, and another pillar of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy is the idea of genocide and colonialism. Genocide, I don't think I need to define genocide, but in the United States, we have a creation myth, and that creation myth begins with Columbus discovering the Americas. The Americas were empty except for a few roving bands of hunter-gatherer natives that were named Indians. And that ever since Columbus arrived, we've been disappearing. And that's a myth. That is our creation myth that has been brought to us, and that fueled the idea of manifest destiny. That there's all of this land that white people, ordained by God, must populate. They must do something with. And all of that is built on the idea that natives are disappearing, that they're gone, and that someday, when all the natives are gone, manifest destiny will be over, and we will have fulfilled God's dream of the Americas being, I guess, the promised land for all of the good people, white people.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and that's an important thing to remember, because it's not just the taking of native lands. It's also the taking of native spirituality. It's taking of native culture. And oftentimes it's the reenactment of those things by non-Indigenous people. And what that does is, and this idea has perpetuated itself, not just in the Americas, but all over the world. That you can, that the Indigenous people are dying, but, and when we bring in this idea of racial hierarchy again, because remember, all of these people that I'm discussing, Black people, Indigenous people, everybody that isn't white is below a white person. And so it is the job of the white person to not only bring forth these people are below, but in the idea of Indigenous people, that they can take what the Indigenous people had and make it their own.
Mm. Well, I'm always amazed at how easy people fall in line with this. And if you buck the system, they're like, wow, you're really a radical, aren't you? Well, for me, I consider myself to be a humanitarian. Like, I believe we're all one people, and that we've been out of kilter. The reason that the planet is ailing is because really because of the white supremacy. This whole idea that the planet is ours to use up, like it's our right to just destroy them. There's no respect whatsoever, at all, for the needs of our planet. As human beings, as a species, we can thrive on this planet if we respect the earth, our Mother Earth. You know what I mean? Like, there's been no regard for stopping the train. We're on this train wreck, and nobody seems to want to just go, whoa, wait a minute, let's reboot here, because this is definitely not working. It's about, this whole thing about the way they do the nuclear remediation. Their concept of nuclear remediation is digging down in the dirt, putting the dirt in bags, hauling it away, and saying we're all good. That is just incomprehensible to me.
Right. Well, it's important to think it's not that everybody has been willing to go along with this. Indigenous people have always resisted the genocide perpetrated on them. They have always resisted the way that the culture that you and I share treats the earth. And that has perpetuated our genocide, because we have said since the first landing, this is not how you treat the earth. And ultimately what they're talking about, if we want to use today's term, it's not sustainable. You cannot sustain the way you treat the earth the way you do it. It doesn't coincide with the web of life. And that's the fundamental difference. What you and I are discussing, this idea of heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, is very much in line with a linear way of thought. Heteropatriarchy, we've got the male on top, the female, and then the children. And they're all straight. White supremacy, we have the white people on top, and then everybody underneath. And because white supremacy is not interested in how those people experience white supremacy for themselves. That's why I have to say white people underneath, because non-white people are constantly trying to figure out where they are within this racial hierarchy, because we live within this system, and we all internalize this. This is our culture. Whether we have these ideas about, oh, our culture is this or that or something else. But as an anthropologist, I see this is how our culture is structured. Anthropologists go into different communities and try and figure out what are the underlying social structures. And this is something that anthropologists who are overwhelmingly white do not do for their own
Jill,
culture.
we're starting to lose you here.
Uh-oh. How's this?
Yeah, that's a little bit better.
Okay. So, ultimately, it's important to remember this isn't something that everybody just goes along blindly with. People of color have always resisted these categories that white supremacy wants to put us in. Indigenous people have always resisted being moved off their land and killed. Black people have always resisted being enslaved to create capital for white people. And now I kind of want to discuss the third pillar, which is this idea of Orientalism and war, particularly now because once again it feels like we're going to ramp up for another war, and nobody in power seems to ever question why.
Mm-hmm.
So Smith has this idea of Orientalism. And Orientalism is defined by Edward Said as the process of the West defining itself as a superior civilization by constructing itself in opposition to an exotic but inferior Orient. And, a lot of times...
I get what you're saying, like a different orientation.
Exactly.
Okay.
So we have the idea of the Orient, it's an old-fashioned idea, but of being Asia. But if we look at it today, what this truly means, we still have those ideas.
Yeah.
Right now our president is talking about his dislike of Muslims, his dislike of China. That is this idea of Orientalism and war in practice. And it didn't just start with him. I grew up before 9/11. I remember a world before 9/11. We did not seem to have a problem with Muslims until all of a sudden we had this huge problem and we needed to invent a reason to go to war for them. And a lot of times that reason was they were the complete antithesis to what American values are.
Or so they told us, because not entirely.
Exactly. I'm not saying it's true at all, but these are the reasons why we've been at war for almost 20 years now.
Well, I think it was just a very clever idea, because then they didn't have to have a nation to attack. They could have a concept, and they could perpetuate war and feed the war machine in small pockets and small groups everywhere around the Middle East. I mean, the way they've demonized the whole entire Middle East. I mean, the pillaging, just the raping and pillaging of their culture, like. This is the seat of civilization, and we're watching ISIS just blow up historical buildings and libraries, and those weapons that they're getting are coming directly from the United States. I don't care how they got to them, but our country built those weapons, and to me, that is a crime against humanity. I mean, just the double-facedness, the backstab. I mean, America is getting exactly, this is how Trump, I listen to people who support Donald Trump saying, well, we have to give him a chance and he knows what he's doing and he's shaking things up. I view him as a complete illiterate who's way in over his head. He has no concept what he's doing. I mean, his tweeting is insane. I mean, he's talking about his tweet this morning that he came out about the illegal exposure of secrets, and it's just he's just defending himself. Narcissistic personality disorder, just off the charts. It's not even subtle.
it's important to remember that while he's tweeting and everyone's getting whipped up in his, lather about what he's saying, he is passing executive orders that reinforce the three pillars of white supremacy. And rather than focusing on what he's saying, we need to always go back to, okay, how does this fit into this into the support of a system that we obviously see is flawed? How do we begin? That is the point of ultimately me coming on here today, so that I can better explain, what people are seeing and what people are getting so upset about. This isn't just happening now. This has happened for generations. It's just finally white people see it.
Yeah, because it's coming too close to home, man.
It is, and it's threatening white women. It's threatening white queer people that, because of their skin color, have had privilege, whether they want to believe it or not. And I definitely recommend that people look into Peggy McIntosh's work, Unpacking White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, because even poor white people do have more privilege than people of color. And it comes up in ways that they could never imagine.
And they do know it.
People
Let's
immediately
just be
get
clear.
upset.
People know it.
Well, I would disagree with that, because I have been told many times, I grew up poor, I don't have any privilege. And that itself is a reinforcement of that racial hierarchy and the hierarchy of power and wealth. So, but to go back to Orientalism and war just really quickly. So we have this idea that we must always have an enemy that is completely different from us, and that we must fight that enemy to reinforce the system that we are in. Because that's ultimately what we're seeing in all of this, is reinforcing the system of hierarchies, of heteropatriarchy and white supremacy. And, and it hasn't just always been the Middle East. We also do this to South America. Many, many countries in South America, we see them as not like us. We got to do something to stop them. And, it's been pretty quiet for, probably 30 years. But if people go and research what was happening in South America in the 60s and 70s, they will see that there were different forms of governing that people wanted to try out. And the U.S. said no, because that does not coincide with the white supremacist, heteropatriarchal capitalist system.
Well, actually, Jill, don't you agree with me? I think that what Trump is doing, this wrecking ball cabinet that he's doing, he's trying to install in America exactly what we imposed on South America. It's a wrecking ball crew. They plan on destroying all of our institutions and privatizing everything. That's really literally, the writing is on the wall.
Well, sure, because there's money to be made, and that's what these guys have always done. That's, the people he himself and many of the people he surrounded himself with are business people, and that's the point of capitalism. Whoever wins with the most money, whoever dies with the most money wins. And so what they're attempting to do is just the manifestation of capitalism overtaking our government. For too long, we've ignored what's happened in other places, the corporate takeover of governments, because, it could never happen here. That's not us. We're too advanced, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is this has happened in many other countries, and now we're just seeing it happen to us. There's a reason why particular multinational corporations are now in his cabinet. It's just, they didn't just learn it. This is a strategy they've been perfecting for quite a long time.
That's right. This is why they just rubber stamped it. No matter how many times they got caught in the hearings lying or misrepresenting what they had told, they just rubber stamped them, because they have no intention of not imposing this on Americans. None. Zero.
No, because they've got they had plenty of practice, and that's why, at Standing Rock, they're so organized. That's why that police force has been so organized against those water protectors. because these are tactics that have been perfected in other places. They've just now come to the United States.
Yes.
And if people truly want to resist what is going on, then they need to understand that we live within a system that I've been trying to explain here. I don't know if I've done a good job. I totally encourage people to look up Andrea Smith's work themselves and read it. Because like she said, she's trying to provide people a framework. We can't begin to truly resist all of these things until we can examine it for what it is,
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise it's too much to take in.
It is, and that's what they count on, it being too much to take in. Like, it's like putting your finger in a dam, or that has all these leaks. You can stick your finger in this one, but it pops out somewhere else, or it pops out over there. And then the conversation is, really, ultimately, what happens is the people with the power, they just walk away from the conversation. They're just not going to participate. Right. They're like, yeah, you guys, it's like that. We got 5 million people in the streets. And that has just been completely demeaned. That was the women's march. It was more than just women in the street.
Which is a gendering of what is going on and a reinforcement of heteropatriarchy. Right. You say a lot of times people with the power walk away. Well, the people with the everyday power are white people. And I'm not trying to just like dog on white people all day by any means, but that was the focus of my talk today. And the thing is, the people with the everyday power are white people. And until white people begin to understand that they're within the system, and their ignorance, their denial, their complicity, their support, their verbal and physical support of it, that is what's going to keep this system going. And then until white people can accept that they are part of this system, that they are a color, we're always ready to ask someone, who are they, what are they, where are they from, where are they really from. Until white people are comfortable asking themselves those questions, we can't change these systems, because they're the ones with the everyday power. The work I'm talking about was written years ago, and yet it hasn't gone anywhere.
Well, it's the same thing about the work that I talk about. This is what I mean, Jill. This is where it came to me. This is why I wanted to talk to you. It's occurred to me that we can't unlock. These are so enmeshed. The lies of the nuclear industry, the alternative facts, as they've so handily called them, they're all enmeshed with this whole system of oppression. It's like people's eyes glaze over when you talk about the nuclear pollution. They act as if they just can't. It'll never change. This is the way it is. I was listening to hearings last night, and they're talking about how we really do need to ramp up our nuclear arsenal. Like, really, we really need, and even the concept that our military, they were saying our military is only at 1/3 preparedness. Well, the reason it's been pared down is, do we really want to be in a perpetual state of war? This is where Trump is bringing us. This is why he says we need to ramp up our military. But is that something that as a goal? We're watching these hearings with all these military guys saying, well, we're desperate for money. We need to have our military. And why this concept that the whole world hates the United States, that we have to spend more than 50% of our budget on the war machine.
That's a pillar of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy, the idea of Orientalism and war. And when we can begin to understand it in those simple terms, we can call it that. We see what you're doing here. You were trying to orient us against someone and make them the enemy so that you can have war. We will not stand for it. It makes it a lot easier than picking the people apart. Mm-hmm. When we see, we need to give more money to the police. Trump just had a meeting with a whole bunch of, sheriffs nationwide. And, I remember him saying, their needs are pretty similar. We got to help them out. We can easily say, we see what you were trying to do here. You're trying to perpetuate slavery by perpetuating the prison industrial complex, by having a group of people without freedom, forced to work, forced to be places. A lot of times, more often than we want to admit, those people shouldn't be there in the first place. We see what you're trying to do, and we will resist. This idea that we need to create more nuclear weapons, and we'll clean up those nuclear weapons by digging up land. Once again, that does not acknowledge that number one, we're on stolen land, and we are continuing that by saying we'll just take it, by saying we're going to go somewhere else and destroy those people. We're reenacting and perpetuating the colonization and genocide on other lands, just like it happened here and continues to happen here. And when we can begin to see these actions of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy within a framework of trying to support itself, keep itself in power, that's when we can begin to resist in meaningful ways that acknowledge that people of color have experienced white supremacy different, that white people have upheld this system even unwillingly and unconsciously, and that people of all genders, need to understand, number one, there's more than one gender, and this idea that there's gender hierarchies. All of these things need to be known, addressed, so that we can have the tools to resist. And I don't know if that made much sense, but
yeah, but these are big, this is the big concepts, because really what we're talking about in all of this is sort of bucking what we internally, our gut reaction.
Sure.
I mean, that's the thing, is
well,
it's just
okay.
so buried
so
deep in us.
So as a Native, but here's the thing. So as a Native, it's important to remember, if this was 300 years ago, I would be living completely different. And yet, because of history and because of the actions of the world, I am able to interact with you in a language we both understand, using technology we both possess. Whereas even 50 years ago, my people were perceived as unable to do this. And yet here we are. So humans have the ability to change. Humans have the ability to shift.
So, Jill,
people within their culture have an ability to change that culture around.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just the fact that we're two women on the radio talking about this, that's a shift from, say, even 50 years ago. So the three pillars, can we sum up the three pillars so we can sort of firm that one is the Orientalism, right?
Sure. Okay, so Orientalism and war. This idea that there is an exotic Orient, completely different from us, that we must orient ourselves against and enact war upon. Mm-hmm. And that by doing that, we are in the good, we are right, and we are upholding our place as the superior beings. Mm-hmm. The second one, genocide and colonialism. The genocide of indigenous people to seize their lands, their cultures, their spirituality through colonialism. Mm-hmm. Slavery and capitalism. The idea that there is a group of people that can be enslaved because all people are seen as commodities within capitalism. And people are willing to accept their lot in life as long as they aren't the slaves, because there will always be slaves to support a capitalist system. And yeah, and ultimately, unless you're black, you can't be enslaved, and you'll just be somewhere along this racial hierarchy. But as long as you're not black, it's okay. For indigenous people, it's not just Native people here in the Americas. It's indigenous people. It's the Palestinians. There's a great example of genocide and colonialism in the modern day. Yeah,
well, that whole concept, that's the shocking thing about the Palestinians is not just what they're doing to the Palestinians, but what they're also doing to the young Jewish young men and women, forcing them. I know several young Jewish people who have left, who refuse to participate in it, who left their country because they got in. They were shocked at what they were forced to do and what they were told to do. It was antithetical to everything.
Right.
They had grown up under
Right.
this little bubble and joined the service, and then, oh my God, I'm supposed to arrest a child? I'm supposed to
Yep. They're
handcuff a
yep.
child? I
Yep. They're
mean,
all required to serve in the military, and what that is a It's the it's it's the real embodiment of the pillar of Orientalism and war. The
well, I see that
Palestinians are
coming our way.
the Palestinians are completely different than the Israelis. Everything they do is completely different. So we must fight against them. Oh, we must take their land, because not only are they completely different, this is our place now. And it will never be our place until all the Palestinians are gone. We must eliminate the Palestinians. That is a great example of two pillars being seen day to day in our everyday lives today.
Well, I know that that's one thing that the people who supported Trump, Trump throughout his whole campaign said he believes in in two states, that the Palestinians have their rights. And now he's starting to talk about not really, not really. We really don't have a two-state program. And it's the same thing with China and Taiwan, like no big deal. I mean, it is really an indication of what's going on. I mean, it's the culmination, I think, of really some plans to just railroad through everything that they want. And this is what you're talking about. The white supremacy is based on these concepts of
Right.
it's
And
okay to just,
heteropatriarchy. And
yeah,
heteropatriarchy. There's a reason why, you know, he has one woman and one person of color on his cabinet.
yeah.
And there are no gay people that I can think of.
Yeah, because that's the interesting thing is they consider that an abomination. It's not an
Yep.
abomination to murder people, but it's an abomination to be gay. I mean, it's just
Exactly.
it's beyond comprehension the doublethink that's gone on and
Yep.
the way that people just immediately accept it without. And again, I keep going back to this because I think it really the more I study this stuff about nuclear, I mean, we went way off track with this whole idea of alternative ideas. I mean, I'm just learning just now that as soon as they discovered the rotogen, they started studying human babies from 1900, 1910, 20s, and 30s. They didn't even ask for parents' permission. If you were born in a hospital and alive, you were likely tested with x-rays or some type of radiation. They were experimenting on people without telling you. Now, which population do you think they really experimented on? Not the white rich people.
Exactly. Because that is that's the upholding of the system that we're discussing today. And so when we can begin to understand the world and the actions of people around us as part of the system, as an anthropologist, that's what I do. You can begin to see how things can change. That ultimately was one of the reasons anthropology came into being, is how can we understand these exotic people from all over so that we can change them. And now it's time for us to look at ourselves and say, okay, what are these systems we live under? And people have been trying to change these systems for a long time because they inflict real harm, damage, and death on people. What are these systems we live under, and how can we change them? This is probably the ultimately the truly first time that people are going to begin to look at it, because now everybody's comfort, everybody's security is truly at risk.
Yeah,
And
the people that they're protecting is a very, very tiny group. That's the
Exactly. And so,
right.
and more people are excluded, more and more people are threatened. And so when we can understand what those systems are that are trying to threaten us, we can do meaningful work that and not get bogged down by, we need to understand that people do experience oppression differently, and we need to acknowledge that. You can't say, oh, well, we're going to, we'll all, I'm going to come to the U.S. and I'm going to help out and things will be better, without understanding that, all of this is happening on indigenous land. The people of Standing Rock are trying to help everybody, not just themselves. And I think that a good way to help them, those water protectors, is to understand that they have persisted and survived, and not just survived, because a lot of times we only think of Native Americans as surviving, which is that narrative of, they're still disappearing. They're trying to bring us through all of this, that we've lived through, all of these ideas that you're disappearing, the land is mine, we can all reach a better place if we make more money. They're trying to say there's another way to live. This is how you have to live. And it's understanding that we are all one together. But part of that understanding that is understanding that, Native American people were here first. And, here on the coast, you and I both live in Oregon, we have this idea of Cascadia. I've heard that kind of floated around. Oh, if all the states on the coast were their own country, we'd be Cascadia. And to that I say, well, it says the land go back to the natives. Otherwise we're perpetuating we're perpetuating those three pillars unconsciously.
Right.
So,
well, if the land went back to the natives, then there'd be a whole reassessment of how we operated, because there's so many non-native people here. I mean,
right.
that's
well,
the
and that's what we're
thing.
trying to seek, right? And that's what we're trying to seek is a new way of examining things and a new way of looking at these things. Because what we're all experiencing in this country now is a serious pushback against all of the progress we've made towards trying to live more nicer lives, trying to be nicer to everybody, trying to respect other people, trying to recognize that people have experiences that are different than ours. People live lives different than ours and give them the space to do it. We're all experiencing a pushback against that. And, if we can just understand that that is a system that's trying to push back against us. It's not just individuals. It's individuals that are part of a larger system, because we're all part of that system, and our actions are just as important as theirs. I can't really think of anything else I truly had to talk about. Do you have any questions for me?
Well, I think it's perfect timing. We've got like a minute and a half left of the show. Let's see, we've got actually 30 seconds left. So it's perfect timing. You've been listening to Jill Wheaton, an anthropologist by a master's degree in anthropology. We've been talking about, I guess it's called white supremacy, right? The three pillars of white supremacy.
Yep. Heteropatriarchy and the three pillars of white supremacy.
That's right. So put your courage feet on, you guys. We'll talk to you tomorrow. And thank you for listening.
Anti-Media Radio.